Welcome back to our series, Meeting Jesus. We've been taking a look week by week at the Gospel according to Mark to get to know Jesus more deeply, who he is, and what the kingdom, the reign of God that he brings is really all about. And as we move into our next two stories that come in the second half of chapter 6 today, anybody who would have heard these stories, who grew up in the traditions of ancient Israel, who would have grown up in first century Judaism, would have heard echoes of stories they knew. Let's start with that. We're going to eventually get to stories in Mark chapter 6 with verses 30 through 44, and then 45 through 52. But before we get there, remember, in ancient Israel's storytelling, in the way that the ancient Israelites and the Jewish community of the first century remembered its own history, where God showed up, people got fed, and people were brought through the sea into freedom, right? The central core stories at ancient Israel's memory are being imprisoned, enslaved by Pharaoh in Egypt for centuries until God sets them free, bringing them through the Red Sea, right? So this ominous obstacle that's preventing them from getting to the other side and away from Pharaoh's grip and his advancing armies and chariots. And God parts the sea with Moses leading the way. The people go through the sea, and it's clear God is the one who's done this. There's this whole song that's sung after they come through the sea. Moses' sister Miriam leads this song about how God has thrown the horses and riders into the sea, and God has triumphed gloriously, and God made a way across the sea. What seemed impossible, God brought them through the water. And once they get to the other side, and there's this band of formerly enslaved people who are now searching for a way of eating, and God provides bread for them all. God provides for them manna in the wilderness that they can make into bread every day, day in and day out, throughout 40 years of wilderness wandering. In the ancient memory of Israel, what God does when God shows up is God feeds us and God brings us through the water. And then there are echoes of that story later on in Israel's history. The great prophet Elijah is remembered as this one whom God had fed when he had no source of food. God sent him food from ravens, and then God sends him to this widow who's got one son, and they are dying of starvation when a famine comes. These foreigners, this widow outside of Israel in Zarephath, and Elijah promises that her little jug of oil and her little container of flour won't run out, and they're provided food all the way until the famine is over. When God shows up in ancient Israel, people get fed. And later on, there's a story where Elijah's successor, a guy by the name of Elisha, this is not confusing at all, right? Elisha one day feeds a group of 100 people with just 20 little loaves of barley. And this is presented as a miracle, that there's no way that 20 little loaves would feed 100 men, and yet it does. Some amazing, miraculous means happens, and this bread is stretched or somehow feeds 100 people. And there's this little obscure story whereas Elijah is passing on his mantle to Elisha as he's going to be taken away, and Elisha will continue on. There's a moment where the two are walking together, and as Elisha comes up on the edge of the Jordan River, the waters part, an echo of the Red Sea story, right, of the parting of the water. So in other words, over and over and over again in ancient Israel's memory, when God shows up, don't be surprised if people get fed in miraculous ways, and don't be surprised if God makes a way through the waters that nobody else thought possible, right? If you grew up in ancient Israel, if you grew up in a Jewish community in the first century, these stories were your bedtime stories. They were what you heard talked about at synagogue. They were woven into dinner time conversations. This is your story, your national, cultural, religious identity, or stories like this, where God shows up, people are fed abundantly, and God makes a way through the water. So, all that in mind, Mark wants us to remember all those connections. When we get to a story of Jesus going off, he's just gathered his disciples back from scattering them out to the wider communities to announce the coming of God's reign. They had been sending out in pairs, and they would go and heal people and announce God's reign was coming and cast out evil spirits. And Jesus gathers them back, and they're looking for a place to be by themselves, but the crowd keeps following them, and Jesus has compassion for them. And so after teaching them, the day is getting late. Jesus' disciples are like, please send this crowd away. That would be the compassionate thing, because the day is going to get late. These people are going to get hangry, and they're far removed from their homes. If you send them home now, telling them, I'm done teaching for the day, I'm done helping, come back tomorrow, they could all go home, get dinner at home. And instead, Jesus says to the disciples, you give them something to eat. And like, Jesus, are you serious? It would take like half a year's salary to be able to provide food for everybody to get just a little. And Jesus asks them, well, what do you have? Go check. And they find out, and among themselves, they're able to produce 5 little barley loaves and 2 fish. Again, this is barely enough for one person's lunch. We're not talking like giant salmon fillet. We're talking about like, little fishies. Like dried fish you might have, like popping sardines out of a can. So here they are with 5 little loaves and 2 fish, and Jesus does something amazing, something that's going to catch the memory of Jesus' followers for 20 centuries since. Jesus takes the bread and blesses the bread, gives thanks for it, and breaks it, and then gives it to his disciples and asks them, you pass it out to everybody. And after having everybody sit down in groups across the green grass, as Mark notes, there's enough for everyone. Not just enough for everybody to get a little bite, but everybody is filled, Mark says, and they even fill up 12 baskets full of leftover pieces. Now, this is amazing, right? There's no explanation for it. Mark doesn't say, how does Jesus do it? He does. Mark just gives us this story and wants us to make that connection where God shows up in ancient Israel's memory, where God shows up in the stories of the Hebrew Scriptures. People are fed abundantly. Everybody gets enough. That was the recurring theme of the manna in the wilderness, right? There's enough for everybody. You don't have to hoard. You don't have to take somebody else's. You don't have to elbow out of the way because there's only so much to go around. There's going to be enough for everybody if we share. You take what you need, you pass it along, and everybody is fed. So here's Jesus doing what is God's classic calling card, right? This is another one of those moments where even though Mark the Gospel writer doesn't come out and give us the words of the Nicene Creed, Jesus is God from God, light from light, he does present us Jesus doing things that are classically only what God can do. That God had worked through Moses and Elijah and Elisha before and fed people, but these are always signs of God's action, God's presence. That Jesus is not just interesting rabbi with some neat new ideas, but Jesus brings us right into the presence of God's own action to save, to bless, to heal. And if that weren't enough, right, after thousands of people are fed, Mark counts it as 5,000 men, who knows how many other women and children there are, but easily, a number of people larger than a lot of towns around here. Everybody's fed, and then Jesus gets his disciples to get into the boat, and they go on across the Sea of Galilee now and dismisses the crowd. The disciples are headed across the boat, and Jesus is going to hold back and get the crowd sent off. And as the story goes, the wind starts kicking up, and it's harder for the disciples to keep making any headway, and they see Jesus walking across the water, and they're like, they think he's going to walk on by, and they're not sure. Are they seeing a ghost? Are they seeing an apparition? Are they all collectively hallucinating? And Jesus responds when they cry out in fears, take heart, it is I, don't be afraid. That's how we translate it in English, but the Greek has more of a play on words to it. The way you say it is I in the Greek of Mark's Gospel is I am, and I am in any Jewish hearer's mind calls back to God's covenant name, right? Yahweh, I am who I am, God says to Moses. So when Jesus walks out in the water and says, don't be afraid, I am, this is that sense of, again, God is showing up in Jesus. Jesus is doing something that typically only God is able to do, right? Making a way through the sea, feeding people abundantly. It's one more moment for Jesus to make it clear he brings the very presence of God. And Mark says at the end of this whole episode, the feeding miracle, the walking on water, bringing them to safety, Mark says the disciples were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. As we've been walking through Mark's Gospel, we've noticed how often the human figures don't get it who Jesus is, but the divine figures, the voice of God, or even the demonic figures recognize who Jesus is. Meanwhile, human beings are all left scratching their heads, some unable to dare to believe that Jesus could be God's chosen one, the Messiah. Others who are beginning to wonder, maybe could this be the one we're waiting for? But even after seeing these clear signs, Jesus is the one who does what only God can do. Jesus is the one who uses God's calling card, feeding and making a way through the water. They still don't get it. Now, that tells me a couple of things. One, Jesus doesn't give up on these guys, even though they persistently have a hard time understanding, and even though we might look back and, with hindsight being 2020, go, how come they didn't see it? It was so obvious. Jesus doesn't reject these guys because they're dense in the head and hardened in their hearts. Jesus works with them. The other thing it's worth remembering is Mark keeps reminding us this story is eventually headed toward a cross, and he also keeps telling us Jesus brings us none other than God in Jesus' own presence. He's setting us up to recognize when we get to the story of the cross, it's nothing less than the same God-man, the same human being who brings the very presence of God into our realities, not just right to our tables, feeding people with 5 loaves and 2 fish, but there to a cross. That's the scandalous thing that Mark is doing in his storytelling, making it clear Jesus isn't just an ordinary human rabbi. Jesus brings us God's own presence, and that one in whom God is present, that one gets crucified and goes to a cross. That's amazing. Now, that just about brings us to the end of chapter 6. So we're going to continue next time, finishing up chapter 6 and headed into chapter 7 of Mark's Gospel. We hope you'll keep joining us, whether you can meet us in person at 1 o'clock every Thursday at Community of Christ, or catching up online in these conversations as well. Either way, keep on joining us and meeting Jesus. See you next time.